Welcome to Global Access. I'm Iain Martin. I'm going to be talking to Calder Walton about Russian disinformation, espionage, spying, and asking the question really, is this new or just as it always happened in history?
Past and Present is the title of this year's edition of Global Access. Is it possible to draw conclusions from past events? Or is man doomed to repeat the mistakes of yesterday? How do authoritarian regimes use their own country's history to secure power? And what role does the individual play? In these interviews, researchers, journalists and writers try to answer these questions. Spies, election manipulation, cyber espionage, disinformation. These are some of the Russian regime's tools against the West. Calder Walton believes that the methods may have changed, but that Russia has conducted this type of business since ancient times.
Calder, welcome. We hear a lot about Russian disinformation and meddling in elections. How should that how should our understanding of the history of Russian meddling inform our policy making today, do you think?
Well, I think that a good starting point is to learn more history. That's generally true, and it's particularly true, it seems to me, with intelligence history. And actually there's a long history of Russian election meddling and interference in various different ways, either by disinformation or by simply trying to bribe Western officials, politicians, throughout the Cold War, even before the Cold War. But the thing is, when you look in most history books about this, that doesn't feature. I don't know why. The records are available, but there just seems to be an unwillingness on the part of most historians to treat this as a major component of international affairs. We read about it in the newspapers today, as you mentioned, but yet you look in the history books and it's not there. So my research, what I'm trying to do is to insert that into the history books and to say that actually, yes, it's going on today, but it's also gone on in the past. The technology's fundamentally changed today, but the principles are the same throughout history. And
why have the Russians always done this?
Well, I mean, in the Cold War, it was part of the ideological struggle between the West and the Soviet Union. So they were trying to undermine democracy and to weaken their strategic enemies, and particularly the US. So that was
presumably they hoped as well that they could tilt certain mainstream parties in their direction.
That's right. I mean, throughout the Cold War, the high aim of the KGB in terms of interfering in domestic politics in the US was to, if it were possible, help get someone elected into the White House. Now, we don't know what, if anything, Putin has on Trump and whether there is some sort of compromising material there. But this was, what we do know for certain was that this was a straightforward strategy of the Kremlin throughout the Cold War, that to have some sort of compromising material over a Western leader was the epitome of being able to win the ideological struggle in the Cold War.
What's your instinct on the Trump business? Well, I mean, because it's conceivable, presumably, that they couldn't have they might not have anything compromising, but they want to make it look as though they do.
That's right. So as with everything with this subject, and particularly with Russia, it's all smoke and mirrors, and you enter into a wilderness of mirrors, so you don't really know what's going on. So we recently in the US had the Mueller report about Russian interference in the 2016 election, and Mueller concluded, looking at all the evidence, that there wasn't sufficient evidence for a criminal conspiracy. It seems to me that leaves open a much broader issue than which he didn't address, that the FBI is currently looking at, which is this issue of compromise. And so just because something is not a criminal conspiracy doesn't mean that Russia might not have compromising material on Trump. My own personal view is that it seems to me likely that in 2008, with the financial crisis, Trump was bailed out by Russian oligarchs because no US banks were willing to lend to him. And I think that that is, as they say, follow the money. And I think that that is what various congressional committees are doing at this very moment, which is trying to get into his tax returns. So who knows, it might not be anything, but that we keep coming back to this. The more and more you look at it, Trump has very strange behavior when it comes to Putin. And it could be something simple as he seems to admire autocratic leaders. He seems to like a North Korean leader. Maybe that's where it's coming from. But there does seem to be something particular about Putin that Trump has a sort of strange obsession with.
So whether they do have something or whether they don't, it can still be presented by Russia as the culmination of
that's right.
a long policy.
That's right.
And they've successfully created some sort of doubt about the loyalty of an American president.
That's right. I mean, at various points in the Cold War, the KGB approached presidential candidates, and in particular in the 1960s, they approached one, and the Democrat, Hubert Humphrey, and he said, I really don't think that I'm supposed to be talking to you, and I really don't think that this would be legal in the US for me to have any assistance from Moscow, which is exactly, if you read the newspapers today, what Trump didn't do. And he's actually saying at the moment, if a foreign government were to come to him and offer dirt, he said, there's nothing wrong with that, I wouldn't call the FBI. Well, historically, we know that his predecessors did exactly that. So there's something strange going on. Again, the fundamental problem, just to take a step back a bit, is the lack of Russian documents. Now, writing about this history in the Cold War, I've been greatly helped by documents brought out of the Soviet Union by defectors, stolen documents that have been published. There's absolutely, so far as I know, nothing similar about Russia today. So it's we're really relying on journalists and interviews with people.
So it could take.
I mean, yeah,
I think
we'll have this interview in 30 years' time, 40 years' time, 50 years' time, if we're still around.
Presumably once Putin has been denounced by a successor or something. And
precisely. Maybe there'll be an easing of the archives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why is it, do you think, you mentioned earlier that it came as it seemed to come as a shock to people, this idea of meddling in elections, and as you've demonstrated, it shouldn't surprise people. And you said that that's because there's so little focus in non-fiction and in history on the intelligence picture generally, but also specifically on
the KGB.
On the KGB. Why is that?
I don't know. And I really don't know. It's a curious thing. So if you pick up most history books of the 20th century or the Cold War, they will talk about CIA coups in various places in the world. They talk about MI6. And I bet you will not find a reference to the KGB, when in reality, what MI6 and CIA and other Western agencies often were doing in these countries was actually against the KGB. So what you're presented with is just one side of the story. So it's a curious thing, and I don't really have a satisfactory answer why it's missing. That, you know, historically it's true to say that there were a lack of documents, but that's certainly not the case now. We've got an extraordinary archive of KGB record material now that was smuggled out of the Soviet Union as it was disintegrating. The so-called Mitrokhin archive, which is just an extraordinary collection. It was kept under lock and seal for a decade or so, but in 2014, it's now publicly available in Cambridge in the UK. So this is an archive, probably the size of this room here, full of the KGB's inner secrets.
Presumably, in terms of history books of the 20th century, if you're dealing with political leaders, people like de Gaulle or British prime ministers or German chancellors, presumably a key part of their day and their routine,
you would think,
because they wake up reading the overnight telegrams and diplomatic cables. This should feature.
Yeah, you would think so. I mean, one of the best books I know of U.S. foreign relations, literally from the birth of America to the present day, has exactly one reference to the president's daily briefing, which is what each president in the post-war years got, and often the first thing they read in the morning. This is the centerpiece of their working day. And to just have one reference to that, I think, gives a very distorted view. In particular, then, another area that's missing is the role of signals intelligence. So the NSA and in Britain, GCHQ. And what I'm finding in my research at the moment is often in the history books it's portrayed as, British statesmen were extraordinarily clever in terms of their negotiating skills. Well, we're now looking at the records. We know that British intelligence helped British diplomats by doing things like bugging all of the negotiations that they held in London dealing with the end of the British Empire. So all the delegates, all their private conversations were bugged, and the colonial secretary at the time got a readout of them, nearly blew the game when he quoted at one point a private conversation. And this wasn't an aberration in the 1950s and 60s. This carried on. So the role of signals intelligence and the briefings that the British statesmen, U.S. statesmen, Western leaders got on the basis of intercepts, I think is a crucial part of statecraft and diplomacy. But again, doesn't really feature. I will have a bet with you that if you pick up a history book of the Cold War, you won't find a single reference to GCHQ.
And so that's almost the hidden history of the 20th century.
That's the point I'm trying. Those of us who work in this field, that's exactly the point that we're trying to make. Is that it's not to say that intelligence. When you pick up declassified intelligence records, you think, oh, this is going to be the inner secrets. This will reveal it all. It's not like that. It's a form of information. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. And on the receiving end, you can see that policymakers at crucial points in history, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as the end of the Cold War approached, the collapse of the Soviet Union, they had information coming in from all directions, and intelligence was one part of that. But it was sometimes a very important part. And just to not ignore that, I think gives a very distorted view of history and the role of how statecraft is conducted.
So you're halfway through a 3-volume history of intelligence and espionage, and this is a huge project. Which you hope is going to recalibrate things.
I hope so. So you're absolutely right. I'm a general editor with Christopher Andrew, my old supervisor in Cambridge. We're general editors of a 3-volume Cambridge history of espionage and intelligence. And we've got about 90 chapters written by world-leading experts, starting off in ancient Egypt and going all the way through to present-day cyber warfare. So this will, we hope, really be a landmark study to say what is the role of intelligence throughout history.
Wouldn't an advocate of the Russian regime say, well, look, why all this criticism of what Putin is doing or attempting to do in this long history of Russian interference? The West is just as bad.
Right.
The West has done this for as long as the West has been around.
Yeah.
And as you just illustrated yourself, it goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. Why should we apply different standards to the Russians?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's part of the problem about the current debate is shock that Russia's done this, and really an unwillingness to talk about why it was that Britain and US in particular did similar things in foreign countries. Meddling in foreign elections, I'm afraid, is a normal part of world politics for the big powers. And so Britain's done it, US has done it. But I think that there are some very different reasons why Britain and the US did it. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union was meddling in foreign countries, particularly in Africa, in order to subvert them and bring them into the Soviet orbit, using democratic elections to really undermine democracy in those countries. Now, Britain and the US deployed dirty tricks as well, forging documents, disinformation, but it was always an attempt to, in the Cold War, to promote democracy, or at least buttress those countries from Soviet subversion. So the tools of statecraft are the same, but they were conducted for entirely different purposes. The big difference, though, about today, to really get at the heart of your question, is why should we rate Russia differently than what Britain and the US? Britain and the US and Sweden, I imagine, all the governments conduct covert action, and Russia does the same. They call it active measures. Same idea. Fundamentally different about Russia is that all of the checks, all of the legal process, all of the apparatus in government that is overseeing covert action in Britain and the US is entirely missing in Russia. So there's no independent judiciary. The political oversight is minimal, and there's no architecture in place to restrain and to check the role of covert action. So it's unsurprising, therefore, that we find that things really get out of control with either the example of the Skripal assassination or earlier the Litvinenko assassination in the UK. Yes, Britain and the US have assassinated people in history, but the architecture in place and how that was done and the legality of that was just so fundamentally different than Russia that it's comparing apples and oranges.
Isn't our oversight, particularly in the UK, but applies in other European countries as well, is that the increased transparency or democratic oversight is it's a relatively new development, isn't it? Post Cold War.
Yeah.
Because the British, particularly, I mean, 30, 40 years ago. The names of the people who ran the services weren't even published.
That's right. So, but that's not to say that there were always cabinet bodies that were overseeing these activities. It's just that they were secret. And now you're absolutely right. The architecture for British intelligence is very different than it was in the Cold War. Now Britain's intelligence agencies exist officially, which they didn't in the past. But looking at the records from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, we can see that the manner in which British intelligence conducted covert action was overseen by committees, and particularly in the Cabinet Office. And usually, if it was something particularly delicate, would get the authorization of the Prime Minister. So there was a system in place. And there was ultimately a rule of law in Britain that oversaw the whole principle. And that, as I said, didn't exist in the Soviet Union and certainly doesn't exist in Russia today. So in the US at the moment, this is a very charged subject of, people call it whataboutism. Well, Russia's doing this, what about what Britain and the US did? And it's certainly an important conversation to have. But as I said, I think that the nature of the states, Russia and the US, Western democracies, it's comparing two fundamentally different things. That's the starting point, it seems to me.
Because in terms of whataboutism, a critic of the West would say, well, you're absolutely right. The public face of the Western campaign during the Cold War was to support democracy, but in reality, Britain and America and the Europeans supported some pretty unpleasant
you're absolutely right.
regimes.
Yeah,
so
precisely.
Is it really just a pragmatic trade-off, or is it organised hypocrisy on the part of the West?
I mean, then though, you know, if we're talking about an unpleasant regime in a certain country that Britain and the US supported in the Cold War, what is the alternative to that? Whoever was in charge, because the person that the Soviet Union was trying to influence and get into power may have been even worse.
How do you think we should approach Russia? Are we in the West getting it largely right or wrong? We've been blindsided in this way, which you described very, very well.
Yeah.
How should we approach it going forward?
If I knew the answer to that, I would be a very rich man. It's a really difficult question, and I think that we need to try to figure out how we've got to where we are at the moment. And it seems to me that the West, Britain and America in particular, didn't really acknowledge the 1990s and the humiliation that Russia experienced as a result of the end of the Cold War. And NATO expansion, I think, retrospectively, it seems to me, we can understand why Russia viewed NATO expansion as a form of aggression. So I think that the answer to your question is, I think that we really need to start to try to view world events through Russian eyes. When I have conversations about this with people in DC, there seems to me an inability to sort of empathize and to say, well, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and never asking the question, well, how's that going to look to Russia? So I think that Russia, at this point, there is a desire to be taken seriously on the international stage. Make Russia great again, I think, is the appropriate slogan.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
But there are two ways to view this, aren't there? So there's that analysis, which acknowledges the concept of the Great Bear, almost the civilizational state, which has to be respected, which had an unfortunate experience in the 1990s, and we have to tread carefully with it and avoid prodding the Great Bear with a stick. There's that approach. Isn't there conceivably, though, another analysis which is actually kind of anti-Russian and doesn't allow, that suggests we shouldn't allow the Russians to create this myth of themselves, this country that regards itself as having a soul, as being unique and almost a sort of God-given country, and that we give them far too much credit, and that actually they're weaker than they appear.
But I think that's absolutely right. But it strikes me that the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, that an acknowledgement at actually Russia, in terms of its economy, is tiny. And it is a weak country. And actually what it's doing at the moment in terms of cyber interference in Western democracies is a way of overcompensating for its essentially weak military domestically. I mean, Putin does everything for domestic audiences. So I think there needs to be a much clearer message from the West about actually the strength of Russia, which is it's not that strong. But at the same time, we've learned from the 1990s what can happen when you humiliate Russia. So I think that history shows quite strongly that just attacking the bear with a stick or beating it away is not going to work. We can now see with the escalation of the Cold War in the post-war years, that was essentially the same thing happened in the 1990s, where there was both Russia and the West were doing things that they thought were defensive, and it looked to the other's side that was offensive or aggressive, and there was this mutual escalation. And I think that we don't want to go back there.
Simultaneously, there is next door the rise of a new great power. What do you think that history of intelligence and our dealings with China, what clues do they give us about how we should deal with China? I mean, are we well set up to understand it in intelligence terms?
I think no. I think that there could be a lot of attention that needs to be given to Soviet-Chinese intelligence relations, and to try to understand that perhaps there are parallel cooperation going on today between Russia and China. One of the great difficult chapters that I'm trying to develop in this Cambridge history is the role of Chinese intelligence. There is a fundamental problem with the lack of sources. I'm not aware of any similar high-level defectors to the West, like the person I mentioned before, Mitrokhin, bringing his KGB material. I don't know of any similar defectors with Chinese intelligence that came to Britain or America. There may have been, and it may be classified. But understanding China and what it's doing, and Chinese active measures, that is a subject that we really need to start to take seriously, and that there is precious little in the public information, in the public domain, based on intelligence records. So
we're, in that sense, we're almost flying blind in terms of trying to understand precisely how the Chinese think of these things.
I mean, you know, I have faith that clever people in London and Washington are doing this, but in terms of the history of this, as I said, Chinese active measures, this is absolutely, as you said, I think we're flying blind here.
But there's a continuity, presumably, right from the launch of the Chinese Communist Party and the creation of the regime, even though there's been an economic opening. I mean, what can we read into just the way that it's behaved publicly?
Precisely. I mean, the Chinese, the Ministry of State Security, there has been a continuity, as you said, during the Cold War from today. But I think that the area that there's always been Chinese espionage focused on Western science and technology, a massive industry in China. That's been the case in the Cold War, and it certainly is the case today. But again, like Russia, I think cyber is really changing the nature of Chinese intelligence. So Chinese cyber attacks, that is where China is really, it seems to me, going to make a serious noise in the future, along with Russia. The level of Chinese espionage to acquire classified British US information is just staggering. We're hemorrhaging material to China at the moment.
But there seems to be some kind of reckoning coming with the Americans threatening the British on
that's right.
the survival of Five Eyes, and the 5G.
I don't see the Five Eyes disintegrating, and I think that Trump, after his visit to Britain, rode back on some of the claims about closing off Five Eyes. As with everything with our current president, it sort of seems to change one day to the next. But Huawei is a staggering example of the difficult issues that we're going to be faced with continually when it comes to China and technology and intelligence, and this sort of fusion between the two, and then Western countries having a different view about it.
What about the range of threats? Because it strikes me, listening to you talk about it, that there's China, there's Russia, there's also the Islamic State.
That's right.
It must be very difficult for Western intelligence agencies and security services to work out
precisely
which is the prime threat. In the Cold War, it was pretty clear, but it's not clear now.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And in the UK, the intelligence oversight committees do publish guides to the prioritization of not how the intelligence agency is acquiring their information, clearly, but the areas. And it must be one of the most difficult jobs in Washington or in London to try to figure out where priority should lie in terms of one threat or the other threat. I don't envy that person with that job, whoever that person is.
Calder Walton, thank you very much.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.